community in Canada, imam is like a trigger word.
Yeah, now. At that time it wasn't that bad. But then I went to university. And then I discovered my religion. And then I became president of the MS, Muslim Student Association, and then I became a haram police.
What?
Haram police, they call it in the community. Everything is haram.
Haram, that means forbidden.
Yeah. So I have a very extremist kind of interpretation of Islam. So I went through that phase where people used to not like seeing me.
You were like that?
I was like that. And
So what was forbidden then?
everything pretty much.
Like what?
There was very little that was permissible, right? And people did. This is you talking. This was me. I was always this is haram. You know, the students wanted to go skiing. I said, "Are men and women going to be together? They had to be on different hills, different sections." So I was like that. So I went through that phase. Then I went to law school, and then of course I started questioning a lot of things, and I almost lost my faith because I started seeing what people practice as Islam. Many people, some of the things they said, because when you go to law school, now you start thinking critically. You ask why. So everything in Islam, I said, why is that happening? That doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. So then, of course, I was lucky that I had a scholar at home that I could go and debate with. Say, hey, how come? So then he started directing me to readings, and then I would go through that and say, there's so much diversity in Islam. Islam is so pluralistic, and so it's not the Islam that I was exposed to in university. But I had a scholar at home who directed me, and I read and researched, and I became very interested in Islamic law. That kept my faith, because now I realized Sharia is much more dynamic. It's very plural. And that's why I say in the national security context, the diversity and the pluralism of Islam is actually our best weapon to challenge the fanatics. Because you can say, look at the diversity of opinion. Because at the essence of any Islamic rule is the maqasid, the higher objective. Why does a jurist make a ruling? It's for the welfare of society. It's not to have a rule. It's for the welfare of society. It's to have the maqasid, the higher objectives. So let me give you an example. So what I started reading, I said, wow, this is such a sophisticated religion which Muslims have dumbed down. Right? So you see like a scholar who's asked a question. Let me give you an example of there's diverse different schools of opinion. So one scholar's asked, and it's written in the fiqh book, if a dog falls into a well, can I drink the water? The scholar gives the opinion, no, it's haram, it's prohibited. Another scholar in another jurisdiction asks the same question. The jurist from another school says, no, it's okay, you can drink it. Now, anybody reading this will say, Islam is weird. There's this ruling here and this ruling here. No, Islam is actually very beautiful because the higher objective is what the scholars were trying to achieve. The area where he said that this was okay to drink this water was in an area where there's not that much water. The Maliki school was in an area where there's dry spells. So if you told people don't drink this water, they're going to die. This other scholar who said it's prohibited said, there might be germs in there, and there's plenty of other water here for you, right? So to me, and they're both Islamic opinions. So there's no black and white in many of these issues, right? As long as the essence of Islam you keep, the ruling's different. That's why you have different schools of opinion. That's how I kept my faith. Wow, Islam is very diverse, very plural, very rational.
Now, you teach in 2 universities, you practice in a law firm, you're a busy guy, you are a fantastic conversationalist, but we have to conclude so that people here can ask questions, or so that those who are watching us can pose questions online on Facebook. And so we're getting ready for that. It may take a minute or two, but there's a question already right here in the front, and our bike delivery woman is coming up right now. Right behind you.
Assalamu alaikum. You mentioned your father threatened and you give him the advice, professional advice as a lawyer. Cat Stephen, you didn't say what happened to him.
Cat Stephen.
Oh, Cat Stephen, he was turned away.
Yeah, they also converted his her or him what happened to her father. You want to fight, I don't say fight is the right word. We want to educate, but at the same time, we have to educate our community and then to communicate to other community.
Sure.
Because, like I said, Imam and the Imam, the appearance is very important. If Cat Stephen have all the work in the United States, prevented him and deported him back to England, how do you treat you or your father? There's no way to have a chance now. Thank you.
So let me answer that question. One of the things about the United States and Canada is, and I say this all the time, I would rather, if I'm going to get arrested or detained somewhere, anywhere in the world, I would pick Canada and the United States. Because why? Cat Stevens got his name cleared. He fought, maybe the expression challenged, okay? I won't say fight. He challenged the laws there, and he was permitted back into the United States. Tariq Ramadan, well-known Islamic scholar, actually was given a job at Northwest Notre Dame University, position. He packed his bags, showed up, rejected him. But the Association of American Professors fought on his behalf and got him cleared. So one of the things about the United States especially is there are people there who will stand up and who will fight for you. Even when that happened to my father, the next day I got a call from the American Civil Liberties Union. Do you want to fight this? Right? The beauty of these countries is that they're a civil society organization that will stand up and fight for you. Okay? Now, unfortunately, in many of the Muslim world, you'll disappear. That's it. Right? Here, as much as I critique the system, but I still think it's a wonderful system. I critique it, I write against it, I challenge it. But there are, remember the travel ban? Hundreds of lawyers. I got emails from lawyers saying, what can we do to volunteer? And they were showing up at all the American airports, fighting for people for free. There were so many lawyers sitting there, they didn't have any work. Right? They were, can I get a file? They're messaging on Facebook, hey, do you know anybody who needs help? They were doing it for free. The vast majority of the people are decent people. When they understand the situation, it's about fairness and justice. Right? So they will stand up. So I think we do need to challenge, we need to use the system, but as you said, the most important thing is education. We need to educate. Americans are not evil people. Canadians are not evil people. Vast majority are decent people. If they understood the issues, they would go for fairness and justice. That's why I said, like, as I said, that travel ban is unbelievable. The amount of people who came out and supported these things. It's unbelievable for me.
We have another question, and I think it's from Idris al-Bakri, who is the former president of the Manitoba Islamic Association.
So thank you for doing a great job at deconstructing Islamophobia. You mentioned that when the quote-unquote Sharia arbitration in Ontario was banned, along with other forms of arbitration, the politicians were getting massive amounts of email and pressure. So this suggests that there's a mechanism, there's a movement behind that. So I was wondering if you could actually address the issue of the Islamophobic industry as well.
There's a huge industry, okay? Hundreds of millions of dollars we know of, and there's hundreds of millions that is not even documented. But there are people who are actually funding, speakers, funding lobbyists, putting out materials, videos, documentaries. I'm shocked at the level of sophistication of these groups, the amount of resources they have. I'll give you an example.
This is the Islamophobia industry.
Yeah, it's in Canada and the United States. Primarily in the United States, but it's here. Okay? And it's been here for a long time as well. They're not as public, but they're there. So the level of sophistication they have, the amount of resources they have is phenomenal. I was invited to speak at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and I sat there. This guy comes and sits next to me at the speaker's table, and he starts speaking to me. He's using Arabic terminology. He's very calm. And then he says, I hope you're going to talk about the sixth pillar of Islam. So I said, what? He says, jihad. I said, no, there's no sixth pillar of Islam, jihad, right? Then I asked him, who's this guy? He was from the Middle East Forum, which is Daniel Pipes, big Islamophobe. So he sent two people there to monitor and to record. Then they wrote articles saying University of Pennsylvania preaching jihad, teaching Islam, publicized. Imagine the amount of resources they have to send 2 people to an event where maybe 100 people showed up, right? To document what that's the amount of resources they have, right? They hundreds of millions of dollars, and some of them are actually, writing op-ed pieces, influencing people. They actually got into the Trump. Steve Bannon, who was the editor of, previous editor of Breitbart, was in there. And there's other people in there who are not as public, but they're there. Even in the Canadian government, there's people who are Islamophobes. They influence. RCMP, one of the first complaints I ever got, this is even before 9/11, was a call I received from a Muslim RCMP officer. He was a convert. He called me and he said, you know what, I want to report this incident, I don't know what to do. I said, what is this? He's an RCMP officer, he's a convert. They don't know he's a convert. And the kind of things that were circulating internally in the RCMP that were against Islam, against Muslims, and he said, this concerns me. Because they're supposed to protect and treat all Canadians a certain way. But their views and the people they were bringing to speak at these events were actually Islamophobes. So if they're teaching RCMP about Islam, I'm scared. If they're teaching CSIS about Islam, I'm scared. CSIS has on numerous occasions, I think they stopped that now, but initially I remember they were calling as their expert witnesses. One of these guys was saying that the 6th pillar is jihad. Now, any person with a basic understanding of Islam will say, there's only 5 pillars. But you know what they say? There's a 6th pillar, and then they say, well, you guys don't tell non-Muslims this because you use taqiyya. You can lie, right? So it's an unwinnable argument. Because if we say something, well, you're lying, and you're allowed to do that for religion. So it's unwinnable with these people. And so Islamophobia industry is unfortunately, it's very powerful. It's here, and we need to challenge that. The only way to challenge it is, of course, to educate and to contact people. When you find out that there's a speaker training the RCMP, training CSIS, we need to challenge this, write to them, look, you should not be using these people because this is creating hatred and fear.
Now we have another question here in the second row. Sorry, I'm trying to figure it out. Sorry, go right ahead and then we'll get to you. Thanks.
So thank you very much for coming out here and a wonderful talk. My question to you is that you're a lawyer, and the law school they teach, you're supposed to argue both sides. So can you articulate an argument in support of Islamophobia from a Muslim perspective? How can Muslims benefit from Islamophobia? Thank you very much.
So how can we benefit? Well, obviously we need to know our system, right? We need to know that we have a legal system here that we support, we back, we use, okay? But more important, I think, for Muslims is to understand your religion, because you need to be able to explain and defend, okay? A lot of extremists are preaching certain things about Islam and Muslims. Some of it is cultural baggage, some of it is actually misogynistic, right? Some of it is baggage that they brought. Some of it are things that are, that's their interpretation. We need to educate ourselves, and that's what happened to me. When I went through law school, like you said, people would say these things, and I would go and research. Oh my God, that actually the fiqh books actually say this stuff. But then I understood, well, fiqh book, that's a human opinion. That's human interpretation. Okay? He, usually, and 99% of the time it was a he. Okay? Why does it have to be a he? I started questioning, can Muslim women be scholars? Of course they can. They were in the past. But now, at one point, it wasn't possible. Now today, Islamic feminists are on the scene. And they're saying, no, we're going to reclaim our original sources and we're going to reinterpret religion. Right? Because human beings have interpreted this. So we need to challenge some of these things. Well, you know what? That was a great opinion. Maybe that was acceptable back then. When I teach Islamic law, I remember one of the students, a very conservative guy, he says to me, well, you know what, you teach wrong, because you say, look at the school, look at the school, look at it. You're supposed to take one school and stick with it. I said, did God give you a memo saying that you stick with one school? Are you a prophet? He says, no. Well then, how do you say that you only need to stick to one school? And then he kept arguing for classes, he would argue with me. Well, no, you can't say that because the school said, well, who said that school is the only school that's valid? There were hundreds of schools. 4 survived in the Sunni tradition, 2 survived But who said the others are canceled? Did a prophet come and say the other schools are not valid? Or did the prophet come and say, then you're not Muslim if you say another prophet came? So he would argue with me consistently. Then one day I got irritated because he was interrupting class, and I said to him, do you have a sister? He said, yeah. Good. Does she go to school? He says, yeah. Wait, do you take her to school or your dad take her to school? He says, no. But all the 4 schools say that you need a mahram. It doesn't say that in the Quran, but these schools say that. So he says, oh yeah, but times have changed. Oh, times have changed, so you made a different ruling. So it finally kicked into him. I said, let me give you an explanation why that's possible. And you're not going against Islam. I said, there's a hadith of the Prophet which says that a time will come when it will be safe for the woman to traverse the desert on her own and she will not be molested.
Sorry, just explain what a hadith is, please.
Well, hadith is either teaching, normative teaching or practice, of the Prophet. Okay, and it's documented in books, collections of hadiths. And these are actually referenced and sourced, and some of the hadiths are actually, they say they're weak. They actually say at the bottom, this is a weak hadith. This is a fabricated hadith. This is there's some consensus on this. So they're just reports. So I said there's a hadith of the Prophet, which is a strong hadith, which says that a time will come when a woman can walk across the desert on her own. So to me, the Prophet wasn't stopping women from going on their own. It was for their safety. And times have changed. So I'll give you an explanation why you let your sister go. Okay. Then later on, after the class, he became my biggest fan. Everything I write, he would tweet out, he would LinkedIn. But he had to come out of that box, right? Because we're taught that if it's, Imam Abu Hanifa said that. Imam Abu Hanifa was a great scholar, but he was just a scholar, right? He's not a prophet. Similarly, it's like the Americans will say, our founding fathers. If you accept everything the founding fathers of the American Constitution said, they would still be raising slavery there, right? Because some of them said that slavery was okay.
Doing some research for our conversation, I discovered that Thomas Jefferson got a copy of the Quran when he was trying to understand a way to design the American Constitution. He was teaching himself Arabic. And he was a deist, he wasn't a Christian, he wasn't a believer in any particular Christian faith. But he thought it was really important to understand the Quran because he wanted to see what superior ideas there were in there. This is Thomas Jefferson.
Yes. And a lot of people won't know this. If you go to the Supreme Court of the United States, you walk into the rotunda, there's Plato, Aristotle, different philosophers. Guess who else is up there? Muhammad. No. So I think there's another question here. There's a picture and there's a bust of the Prophet there, and you know what happened? Some Muslims went and saw this and said, haram. And they wrote to the Supreme Court, said this is haram, this is against our religion.
Because you're not allowed to have representation.
So you know what the Supreme Court did? The Supreme Court wrote to a professor of Islamic law, and the professor of Islamic law, Aziza al-Hibri, wrote to the Fiqh Council of North America, to Sheikh Taha Jabir al-Wani, and Sheikh Qardawi. They wrote to them, they said, this is what's happened, what do we do? So they wrote a fatwa, a legal opinion, which is published in the Journal of Law and Religion. I get my students to read this. I say, here's a modern fatwa, which is argued, it goes through the rationale, it examines the precedents from the past, and says, in the past, this was prohibited because they used to worship this. But this is, today, people are not worshiping this. There's no fear that people are going to worship it. And this was done to reflect that Prophet Muhammad contributed to the development of our law. So you know how they say Judeo-Christian law? No, it's not. It's Judeo-Christian, Islamic, Hindu. All civilizations contributed to where we are today. So this was an acknowledgement. So the fatwa said, because of these reasons, there's nothing wrong with it. Right? That's a modern fatwa by who? Taha Jabir al-Wani, Qardawi, Qardawi is actually banned from going to the United States. So he's not an American lover, right? And Taha Jabir al-Wani, they raided him for anti-terrorism, right? But he did a principled fatwa and he said, well, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay? So Islam is about thinking. It's about the fact that there's this diversity of opinion, and this is the best tool, as I said, I want to keep repeating, this is the best tool to fight radicalism. because that's your interpretation. 99% of us have this interpretation.
Thanks too for redefining fatwa, because the only thing that non-Muslims associate with the fatwa is what happened to Salman Rushdie with the government of Iran. So there's a great deal to learn here tonight. There was a young man here in the front and then the woman this side. Did you want to give a question? Let's make sure that's on. Yeah. There we go.
Hi, Assalamu alaikum. First off, I want to say thank you for coming tonight. I really appreciate your candor. This has been a fantastic event. The question I wanted to ask was with regards to, say, nominal and moderate Muslims. I try to engage people online that are Islamophobic, to try to give them another side and educate them. And what I've noticed in Canada is a lot of people that are sort of on the fences and they don't know what to think about Islam has the same general grievance. We are afraid that moderate Muslims or non-moderate Muslims can become radicalized too easily, and the reason a lot of the reason they feel that way is because they feel that we don't do enough as moderate Muslims to speak out against the terrorism or to combat the 0.03% that defines us. So my question to you would be, what advice would you have for younger people to engage properly to alleviate these fears of us moderate Muslims becoming radicalized without doing it in a proper way that's conducive? And the reason I say that is also my father is an imam, so I completely appreciate the fact that you try to back it down a little bit, which is why I try to do it. I try to give people the other side. So what's the best way to do that to alleviate that fear?
So first thing, I don't like the term moderate Muslims, because moderate Muslims means somebody who basically, the way it's used now is basically like Uncle Tom's for the black community in the past, where they used to have, these are field Negroes and house Negroes. Well, the house Negro is always going to decide with their masters because they get the privileges. So the so-called moderate Muslims today, that they're about reform, they talk as if they introduced the idea of ijtihad. Ijtihad is independent reasoning. Okay, Islamic law, I need to go back a little bit. Islamic law, the sources are the Quran and the Sunnah. And then you have ijma, which is qiyas, which is ijma is consensus, and qiyas analogical reasoning. And ijtihad, some schools consider part of qiyas, some will consider independent. Okay, so ijtihad is a part of Islamic tradition from the time of the Prophet onwards. But these so-called moderate Muslims pretend as if they woke up last week and they came up with, we have this way to reform Islam. It's called ijtihad. So Irshad Manji, modern Muslim, okay, says, the trouble with Islam, but I had the answer, we're going to reform. Islam has always gone through a wave of renewal and reform. Islam and tajdeed. If anybody who studies Islam, it's always a cycle of renewal and reform, renewal and reform, renewal and reform. Right? So this is not new. So I don't like this term modern Muslim, because as I said, it's being used by these. Now, we're talking about the majority of Muslims, all right, who are against the violence. Now, I don't know what else we could do than we have not been doing already. Okay? There are thousands, literally thousands of fatwas. When I speak, I get this question, how come Muslims don't? Short of branding every single Muslim kid born with a tattoo here saying, I condemn terrorism, there's not much else we can do. Okay? The media does not cover people apologizing. Or people say we condemn terrorism. That's not news. News is when somebody does something sensational. Right? So there's actually a center, multiple centers in the United States which have documented all the fatwas that have been issued against terrorism. From even people who are on the rejected list of who are called terrorists by the United States. They've actually condemned terrorism, right? So there's not much else you could do. What you could do is maybe point them to these links. I could share some of these links. There's actually University of North Carolina, University of Chicago, all these people have compiled lists of thousands of fatwas. Some fatwas are signed by 100,000 scholars in India, for instance. Okay? There's even books published that are talking about, well, jihad is about self-defense. Jihad is not, terrorism is not jihad. So there's lots out there. All you can do is you have to say, look, it's the media coverage is not going to promote this. When I remember speaking at one time, I used to write regularly in the National Post at one time, and then I got into a fight over they wanted me to do something, some article. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I left them. But I was speaking at that time with one of the editors, And, he was saying, oh, people don't. I said, I write so many things like that, they won't publish it. And so I called him out in the public at that time. I said, next time I write, you better publish it. And then because he was embarrassed, he's willing to publish it. Right? Because it's not newsworthy, it's not sensational. Dog bites man is not news. Man bites dog is news. Right? So Muslims think we condemn terrorism. Nobody wants to hear that.
Okay, take a breath. And we have another question here in the front. Was this the woman with the cranberry colored hijab? No. Sorry, and there was... Who has the microphone? Okay, go ahead, please.
Assalamu alaikum. My question is that our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the central figure to our belief and practices. But what we see in the Western world, every now and then there is something like cartoons and like movies, and which actually hurt the Muslim living here in the Western world. So what should be our reaction to that? And especially for the youngster people, what's the appropriate reaction to that kind of Islamophobia?
So, see, satanic verses...
Repeat the question just so that we understand.
Well, the question was, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is a revered figure. There's all these cartoons and attacks on the Prophet. So how do we respond to something like that? So I think this became big news after satanic verses. That's the time that, Salman Rushdie, for those who don't know, wrote this book where he said it was fiction, and then he was basically belittling and attacking the Prophet and companions, etc. So the world reacted by now burning the book. Okay? Burning the book in the Western tradition has deep meaning. Okay? Because it was challenging knowledge and education. And so when Muslims started doing that and protesting, we actually brought attention to this. Otherwise, it may have been just a regular book. But by doing these activities, and then Ayatollah Khomeini taking advantage of this for political purposes and issuing this quote-unquote fatwa, but calling it the death sentence. A fatwa is a non-binding legal opinion, first of all. Right? It's a non-binding legal opinion. And there's even a question, can somebody issue an extraterritorial fatwa? Okay? But leaving aside all those technicalities, he did this, and it became big news. But any Muslim who would have been reading Islam would have this thousands of books that actually claim to be history and have attacked the Prophet worse. Okay? All the libraries were full of this. They're historical books, not fiction. But nobody made a big deal out of it. Nobody burned those books, and nobody cared. But the moment we gave it attention, it became big. Okay? Then people now started seeing this is the way to poke. This is the way to poke Muslims. Right? So the way to react is intellectually, academically responding to this. Because we remember, the Prophet was attacked when he was alive. He was physically threatened. He was called all kinds of names. But the documented incident, for blasphemy, most scholars will say there's no death sentence for this. God says that He will deal with these people. And there's instances where numerous prophets, including Prophet Muhammad, were attacked. And the Quran talks about it, but nor does it say none of these people are killed or whatever, right? So the fear of Islamophobes, blasphemy, even this M103, oh my God, Islamic blasphemy laws are coming to Canada. Right? This was a fear. It's irrational because the criminal law will not permit that, even if that is your interpretation of Islamic law, and it's questionable, because many scholars have said this is not the punishment. God will deal with the blasphemer. God will deal with an apostate. Because how can you have a verse in the Quran which says that La ikraha fi din, there's no compulsion in religion, and passages in the Quran say they believed and disbelieved, they believed and disbelieved. They wouldn't be able to do that if they were killed the moment they disbelieved. Right? So there's a lot of these things that people are afraid of Muslims need to explain. No. I know in my own family back home in India, there's atheists. Nobody's ever killed them. Nobody ever, you have arguments. I have a cousin who, when I say, oh my God, he says, oh my dog. Right? He says that in front of me, like, people look at him weird. Okay? But nobody says, oh, let's pass a fatwa on him and kill him. He comes in, he has dinner with us, and we just treat him, people treat him differently. But the issue is, this fear is there. Why? Because Muslims, some of the illiterate Muslims around the world overreacted to this, unfortunately. And they created this fear that, look, the moment you say something about the Prophet, and it's also important for the non-Muslims to understand that the Prophet is revered. Okay? So in my PhD class, I remember a discussion about this. Why Muslims get so irritated and so offended by this? So I said, look, a Muslim child, from the moment they're born, they're taught what? You listen to Allah, you love Allah first, then you love the Prophet, then you love your mother and your father. Okay? So this is the order that you're taught. You ingrain that in your little child. Okay? Now, so of course you revere this person so much. So imagine I said to the person, they said, well, we just want a dialogue. And they did the Danish cartoons, one of the students said, they just want a dialogue with Muslims about free expression. I said, if I'm your neighbor, and I walk out of the house, and I say, I want a dialogue with you, I say, your mother's B-I-T-C-H. Are you going to dialogue with me? Or are you going to get upset? Or I'm going to get upset? Well, for Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad is very revered. So when you say, I want to engage a free expression with Muslims by attacking, this is nonsense. This is just to incite hatred and fear, just poking someone. But at the same time, the Muslim reaction should not be call for the death or burning books and all that. We should be rationally debating with this and challenging them and say, look, the Prophet never promoted this kind of idea.
We have another question here in the front.
Oh. So you changed your mind. You want to speak now? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, Assalamualaikum. I just wanted to say that I really love and enjoy everything that I'm hearing so far. I love what Dr. Khan said. I'm loving the discussion that's going on right now. And most importantly, I love the recitation of the Quran that was said at the beginning. My brother has I don't think I have a question per se, but more like a hope. And I'd like to just share a little story, I guess. Sure. So, last week, Friday, there was a mental health and awareness fair that we had in the masjid. And I had given out a piece of Dawah literature to one of the agencies. And the woman at the agency contacted me, called me back. And she said that there was a line in one of the pamphlets that sounded very anti-Semitic. And it got me thinking about certain things as a Muslim in this community. And my brother has a saying, and basically what he says is whenever we have a finger that points at somebody, we have three fingers that are pointing back at us. And I guess where I'm going with this is, there's no mistake, of course, that Islamophobia exists and it hurts every single one of us as Muslims. But as Muslims, I'm hoping that we also take responsibility for the instances when we don't, when we engage in intolerance within our own community. Because I think that if we're going to speak out against Islamophobia, I think we also need to speak out against whatever intolerance there is within our own community. And I'm thinking about, my aunts, my parents are from Trinidad, and I don't mean to push my parents under the bus or anything, but my aunt went to Trinidad recently, and she said to my parents, so, if your daughter, if there was a black Muslim man who proposed to your daughter, and then an Indian Hindu man that proposed to your daughter, which one would you prefer for your daughter to pick? And I knew what my parents would say.